G'day folks and welcome back to the Totally Tanked podcast. This is episode 7 being recorded on Saturday the 18th of January 2020. My name is John and I'm joined in the pod by...
Rob, hello.
Hello. Now Rob, what tank are we talking about today?
The M4 Sherman.
The M4 Sherman. This is not a small subject.
No, there is a lot to be said about this one. Designed by the Americans, used by pretty much everybody in the world who wasn't a Soviet bloc country after the Second World War, because the Soviets used them during the war. So it's seen a lot of service, did a lot of things, and a lot of people are really passionate about how this tank won the war for the Allies.
Or didn't.
It
was the best of tanks, it was the worst of tanks.
My thoughts on that, quantity is its own quality.
We will get into that. Now, it's a funny looking tank, and it's one of those things for such a absolutely seminal tank, you know, like it was the most produced tank of the Second World War, I believe.
No, T-34s had about 15,000 more, but they were producing them, having gotten into the game so late of building these things, they were producing 2,000 a month from 42. So whereas the T-34 was around from the beginning of the war.
Yeah, and 50,000 of them built, so an enormously produced tank. Looks funny. If a kid drew a picture of a tank, it is unlikely it would look like a Sherman.
No, this is true. It is great. Rather than the big boxy things with a great big turret on top, this thing's a sort of triangle with with a square on top, a bit of a rounded square on top.
Yeah, I mean, look, the turret is fine. It does have a very boxy high hull, which was apparently a requirement of the way the engine was shaped and mounted. They basically built the tank around the engine, which is not a
bad start.
Not a totally bad way to approach the thing. The other point that has to be remembered with the Sherman is that every part of it was designed to be shipped to somewhere else in the world. It wasn't like the Russians and the Germans who could basically build a factory nearish to the front and
roll them out
and roll the raw materials to the factory and produce the tanks and roll the tanks to the front line. Not that anyone ever chose to be rolling their tanks to the front line, but it certainly happened on both sides.
The Sherman was built because 80% is good enough for government work, and it was standardised, reliable, ease of production, logistics is all built there. So the whole idea was we can build 2,000 of these things a month and know that they're all interchangeable. Everything's going to work with each other. It's all the quality of it's going to work. We only have to train the crews to do one particular job, and they can jump in any tank and be able to do that.
Standardisation of crew training is vastly underrated when people talk about these things.
So durability and maintainability was another big thing. And look, as some US general said, I don't know what this logistics stuff is, but I want some of it.
I think a big thing that gets neglected, not obviously by American military planners, but by a lot of people who talk about these things, is that this tank had to fit in the hold of a ship. You had to be able to get it into the hold of the ship. You had to be able to get it out of the hold of a ship, which meant you couldn't build anything heavier than 40 tons because the cranes in the world's ports just weren't there.
Yeah, and look, whereas a lot of the German tanks and the Russian tanks were much heavier, the heavy tanks, so this is a medium tank, so it's only ranging up to 33 tons. Some of
them 38. But
but that was really the high armoured ones. Your general tank was usually around 31 tons. They could drive over bridges, they could go through towns, they were narrow enough, they could go down narrow European streets or through the buildings if they so desired. But the point was,
you don't win a lot of friends by driving your tank through their house.
But whereas a lot of those other bigger tanks couldn't go over the old bridges through Europe.
A lot of towns in Europe, the town will be built around the bridge because it's a natural choke point on the communications. The bridge will be in the heart of the town. A bloody great tank, particularly if the gun overhangs the tank by a significant margin, as many of the big late war tanks did, they literally had to start demolishing houses to get it around the corners to get it to the bridge. And, as we've noted, that doesn't win over the hearts and minds of the locals.
Yeah. Whereas the Sherman, with its little 75mm gun, which didn't even overhang the front of the tank, was so short when it started coming across in mid-war, essentially, in 42, it could turn those corners if it could, and it didn't overhang. It could. There was no problem with the barrel not being able to turn, because if the tank could get around it, the barrel could get around there, which is depicted wonderfully in Kelly's Heroes.
Yes. Now, let's quickly go through the secondary armament, because one of the cute things about the M4 Sherman, and it is an American tank after all, is that, yes, you've got a moderate 75mm cannon, although it should be noted that when it first came into production, that was a big tank gun and more than capable of piercing any tank in service at the time.
It was worthwhile against the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs that were running around at the time. But as soon as the Germans started producing the Panzer Vs and the Tigers, that gun wasn't good enough.
Sure, but it also had a 50 caliber Browning. It also had two 30 caliber Brownings, and there were often numerous other tanks bolted on, and the crew tended to pack significant numbers of guns as well. I mean, they bristled small arms firepower.
I remember, I can't remember the numbers, but it was like 3,000 or 5,000 rounds for each of the M30s, and another 1,200 rounds for the 50 cal for low flying aircraft, anti-aircraft fire.
I do like the idea of you're not actually going to hit a plane, but just shoot at it.
I was about to say, it makes you feel good as it blows you up thinking, I was doing something, rather than saying, oh shit, there we are, we're going to die.
I would say, to be fair on that criticism, that if I'm flying a plane attacking a column of tanks, 50 cal full auto will get me to fly higher. And not come as close. And that
of course, you got to fire the bloody thing from outside the tank, so nobody wants. So it really was an anti-aircraft firing point rather than anti-infantry, because any soldier with a rifle in a good position, seeing somebody standing on the outside of a tank
normally
like that,
the tank commander. Yeah,
yeah, I'm going to shoot him first. Yeah. But, all right, and the driver's assistant. And his Browning 30 cal,
as made famous in the movie Fury, which I watched again this week.
Yeah.
But now, as I've noted, I think bow gunners are the stupidest thing ever put on a tank.
At least with the KV-1, you have the rear gunner, so when the infantry's sneaking up from behind, you can start shooting at them. Whereas that
wasn't bow mounted either; that was turret mounted.
Yeah, I know but at least
traversable.
Yeah, know? And you could. It was shooting at the things that are behind you, where you're vulnerable. Whereas this thing is you got your little 30 cal pointing forward with no range of fire and basically taking up another seat.
It did have some range of fire in the later models. It wasn't completely fixed in the later ones, but in the early ones it was just wherever the tank was pointing.
And not only that, is you got another position that having 5 crew members.
And only 3 hatches. That was a bone of contention.
Well, who gets out first? The crew commander, that's who. But the assistant driver, who does nothing except man the that 30 cal and basically is a bit of a dog's body, is useful in order to be able to train somebody up in a tank, but with the numbers of losses the the M4s were having, basically, if you've got 3,000 guys, it's 2,000 guys going through training at a time, and you can only mount them in 40 tanks, because you got what's the number? I'm no good with numbers without spreadsheets. Okay. 200 tanks versus if you had 4 crew members and you could put 250 tanks into the field. Which would you rather have? If you're training up 4 crew members versus 5?
It depends on your country's national situation in very real senses. Is your tank crew training pipeline exceeding your ability to produce tanks? That can happen. Is your ability to produce tanks exceeding your ability to train crews? That can also happen, particularly if your tank tends to lead to crew fatalities. One of the things with the Sherman is that, yes, it got penetrated quite a lot, but the crews tended to survive. It was one of the reasons it got a bad reputation was because there were millions of stories of, oh my God, my tank blew up, whereas everyone else's tank, the tank blew up and the crews were all dead and no one was complaining about it. There's some survivorship bias going on. It's, what I'm talking about.
Well, that might have happened when they started having the ammo racks stored in wet racks or in no longer on the side of on the inside sponsons of the tank. But until they started making those changes, these things went up pretty quick. I haven't seen any numbers to show that the Sherman actually lit up any quicker than any other tank. It definitely could light up, and the wet stowage reduced the crew casualties in a result of a penetration from something like 80% down to 5%.
So, I mean, the wet stowage of the ammunition. And for those who are interested, the shells weren't actually in water, but they were in a rack that had water tanks all around it. And it was a mixture of water and glycerine, because apparently that's better, for reasons I don't entirely understand. And then if it got penetrated, it would penetrate...
It probably doesn't evaporate as much.
Maybe. Anyway, that would penetrate the tanks, and then the tanks would flood the ammunition.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. And adds a bit of weight, but if it's reducing your casualty rates from 80% down to 5%, that's huge.
Patton was getting annoyed with when he was doing his wild ride through Europe. He was getting annoyed that he was getting so many more maintenance issues from these M4s. And they did a quick study of it and said, you know what, that's because the crews are putting on all this extra armour on the outside to stop the Panzer strikes from penetrating the tank.
And if you were getting shot at with shaped charges, you'd want to put some fly screens around the tank too.
You would. But all they did was they did a quick study and found that they weren't actually reducing the penetration ability of the German anti-tank weapons, but they were causing
suspension blowouts.
Well, no, so overheating usually of the engine. So that's why he made the controversial decision, because people were saying, "But you're going to get us all killed." He said, "No, not allowed. None of my crews are allowed to have any armor, sandbags, or anything else welded to the outside. They'll pitched on the outside of the tank, because it's not going to do you anything except make your tank break down." Which, if you're a canny tank driver and you didn't actually want to be in the fight, might not have been a bad idea.
Now, we are going to come back and talk more about the Sherman's World War II history, because can't talk about this tank without talking a lot about that. But it did have a very significant post-war lifetime, didn't it?
Ongoing, and the last ones were taken out of service in Paraguay in 2018, so only 2 years ago.
Yeah,
they weren't built in 1944, obviously, but they had been upscaled, upgunned, and all sorts of other things. But I
don't think you're in an elite guards unit when they're putting you in a Sherman in 2018, are they?
Yeah, but this is Paraguay we're talking about. All they're trying to do is make sure the locals don't revolt too hard, and you can run them over. It was very good for running over protesters.
Latin American wars are an understudied and very interesting field, but agreed not normally fought with top quality equipment.
No, and look, it was used. The Argentinians produced them, bought them, and upscaled them. They were all in the process of building up a force of them to invade Chile in 1978, when the Pope stepped in and said, "Hey, come on, guys." You don't really want to do this, and then because Chile had some as well. It was a case of going to be Shermans on Shermans, but realistically, the Shermans in South America were being used for coups. There wasn't a lot of nation on nation conflicts with tanks through the last 70 years, but there was a lot of coups, revolutions, counter-revolutions, and all that sort of stuff, and the Sherman was there. Same with the AMX-13, which we spoke about previously.
True. I'm just going to run through the list of post-World War II conflicts that the Sherman has fought in. So you had the Indonesian National Revolution, the Greek Civil War, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Korean War, the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Revolución Libertadora, which is a new one on me, the Suez Crisis, the 1958 Lebanon Crisis, not to be confused with any of the other Lebanon crises, the Nicaraguan Revolution, the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, the Six-Day War, the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, the Yom Kippur War, the Lebanese Civil War, the Uganda-Tanzania War, and the Iran-Iraq War.
And that's just the nation-on-nation conflicts. As I was saying, there was a lot of internal conflicts that it was running around as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing a coup, all you really need is a steel hull and a big gun with a high explosive shell, and probably the machine guns are more useful than anything else. It's certainly anything other than another army unit is not going to cause you any trouble.
No.
But yeah, it's one of those cases where even countries with large, heavily armed police forces really don't have a lot of anti-tank gear.
No.
Be interesting to see how some of those tooled up American police forces go. They've got armoured rams and things where they
They're all they'd all have National Guard units. They just go take them out of that and be better armed than the Australian Army, probably.
Probably, yeah. Or more guns anyway. It's usually the way. Any of those conflicts really leap out at you. Certainly, I think by the time of Yom Kippur, the Israelis really regretted... I mean, they regretted their use of the AMX-13s in that war. That was a real war where the Arab armies, yes, they lost, but they certainly surprised everyone with their use of mobile anti-tank missiles and mobile air defences, which caused a lot of grief to the Israelis, and that was pretty much where they decided the Sherman was reaching the end of its useful life for them, as opposed to the mighty Centurion, which is still in use. Yeah. Any other favourites in that lot?
No, nothing jumps out. As I said, I had fun reading up about the South American bits and pieces as it travelled all around the place, because we've covered that previously with the AMX-13, so I thought, these are interesting to go together.
Yeah, I would think the Korean War is worthy of a mention as well, because it's where the Sherman ended up having to fight
the T-34.
T-34s more modern Russian T-series tanks than the
and
34.
It was interesting to watch, to do some of the reading with it about how in going through Germany, everybody was saying they should have had more Pershings because they had a bigger gun, and it would have been really much better against the Tigers and the Panthers. But in Korea, where they did have more of the Pershings, they actually found the M4 was better because it was better, it was more mobile and better to be supported. So it was really a case of what are you taking on at the time. So, but it was taking on T-34s in Korea, and they were there. They managed to, bring it to a stalemate.
Yeah, during the job I was doing last year, had to do a lot of reading to try and communicate to an Australian audience some of the Australian troops fighting in Korea. And that long withdrawal, I believe it's the longest retreat ever conducted by the US Army from out of North Korea back down to the where the current
parallel
border between...
38th parallel?
38th, maybe?
Yeah,
something like that. Underreported, underknown. No one particularly likes to talk about it, but
7 million Chinese troops who had just come off the finished their revolution and started flooding in and saying, "Oh no, we're North Koreans."
Yeah. But it is little understood how good those Chinese troops were. The idea that they were conscripts in human waves, not at all true. They were volunteers. They were veterans, of very successful. And years of fighting against Japanese and
Republican,
and other Chinese, and that long withdrawal was really quite a thing, and the ability of the Commonwealth and American forces to maintain their cohesion and pull off that withdrawal is little appreciated. Some of the pictures you see of them slogging through the snow through these windswept valleys
would not have been fun.
Yeah, but definitely not one of the Sherman's better moments, somewhat overmatched and kept in the fight largely by massive use of air power. Cool. Is it time for the beer review?
I think so.
Hey!
Today we have Pirate Life Pale Ale.
Yeah, right. So, Pirate Life is an Australian craft brewer that has been bought out by, it says AB InBev on the cans, which is interesting because AB InBev's divesting its Australian breweries. I don't know if they're hanging on to Pirate Life, maybe. But they were for a while the enfant terrible of Australian craft brewing. One of those classic stories that all Australian beer media is all about. It's about mates and friends and coming together over a beer to start a journey. And the fact that someone had to chip in $10 million to make the journey happen, we don't like to talk about. So it's mates who've got $10 million.
That's a good mates to have.
Yeah, those are very good mates to have. So based out of South Australia, they brew very hoppy beers. I think this is a touch on the grassy side myself.
Well, you would know that better than I.
But in general, if you see a Pirate Life beer around, I once did a beer tasting at a shop, and this bloke came up to me and said, "Oh, some craft beer, is it, mate?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Is it Pirate Life?" I'm like, "Oh, no." He's like, "If it's not Pirate Life, I'm not interested." So, no free beer for him.
No. Well, it's as I said, it's a pale ale. It's 5.4%, 350ml can. 355ml can, sorry.
So this is an IPA in pretty much anyone's book, except Pirate Life, who also make many IPAs. But
right.
Yeah, and it's quite striking. There's not too much piratey in their branding. It's just vaguely evocative of a maritime theme. and the eye is upside down. Nothing's more pirate than putting your eye upside down.
It's not even an R on it.
No, they don't roll their R's. Never seen them with eye patches.
Yeah, I was going to try and get an American beer for this, but when I went in, all they had was Coors and Millers and Budweiser, and I said, I'm not drinking that.
No, you need some Sierra Nevadas or Russian Rivers. And,
I almost got us a Red Stripe. I thought about that.
That's
Jamaican. I thought, I haven't had that before. Let's give it But no, I thought, I'll get something a little bit nicer. Maybe next time. We'll find a Jamaican tank.
Could be looking for a while for that.
Marcus Garvey, mate.
All right, let's take a pause for a moment. So, Rob, tell me about the variants.
There were many and varied. When we say
the variants were varied, were
yes, they were. When we say the M4 Sherman, there were so many configurations of this thing. Even though we say it's all standardized, there was 11 different factories building these things in the US, and even one in Canada, and each factory built to a different standard. So some were petrol engines, some were diesel, some were V6s, some were V8s, all sorts of different...
Oh, they weren't Vs, they were radials.
Oh, and some look, that might have been most of the versions, but there was some...
Okay, I'm not saying no Sherman was ever built with a V, but that boxiness of them was because they basically had a radial aircraft engine.
And the British M4A4, which was the Yanks didn't like because it was too hard to maintain. They shipped it across. So it's one of the first ones they built. They shipped it across the British. The British said, we'll just train our mechanics to be able to work on these, and found them really useful. So again, it had like the guy saying about 30 spark plugs in it, 5 different engines all shoved into the one container, and away it went. But it was one of those things that, yes, it was standardized and there was a lot of standard parts, but there was a lot of variation there. Speaking of variations, you had the basic box standard, which had a 75mm gun. That was pretty much it. And that was the M4A1, I want to say.
Yeah.
And then you had the tank destroyers. Then you had the flamethrowers. Then you had the self-propelled guns. Then you had the rocket versions of them. Then you could fit dozers and mine clearers on the front. And there were bridge layers. There was armoured recovery vehicles. There was beach armoured recovery vehicles. There were amphibious vehicles called the Donald Ducks. And they mostly sank at Normandy.
I was going to say, I wanted to talk about the swimming Shermans because I have actually, at the Tank Museum at Bovington, seen they've got a Sherman in its canvas shroud that was meant to provide enough buoyancy for the tank. And I remember going up to it with my partner Sheridan and my nephew Teddy, who's about 6 years old. And I said, that was unbelievably dangerous. And they were like, oh, was it? Okay. And then on the plaque, it was like, of the 78 used, 76 sunk, with all hands lost.
Because they tested them on lakes and rivers and not the open ocean.
Yeah. So when you've only got, 1 inch of freeboard, a very small wave is problematic. I would also like to point out the enormous difference in capability of an original model Sherman, which was at its time a world-beating tank, versus a mid to late 1944 Sherman with the whetstone ammunition and the 76mm gun and the HVAP ammunition with the tungsten penetrator. That late war Sherman was still an astonishingly competitive Sherman. And then you get into, we've talked about reliability, but what made reliability? Things like the Americans had proper design tolerances and proper replaceable parts so that you could take any part in the warehouse and stick it on any Sherman and it would actually fit. And that was not common, definitely not common with the Russians, not common for the Germans, not common for the British. For those guys, they needed an artificer who could, shave bits off the part and re-drill holes, and you could change the transmission of a Sherman in 2 hours.
And the big thing was you didn't need to know what parts you were shipping forward. You just say, yep, here is a standard box of parts. We're going to ship that forward. And when it got there, you'd be able to use it. Not a case of, we've got the T6 model over here, so we need to make sure this box of parts goes for that. And we've got the Tiger II late war model over there, so we need to make sure that box of parts go. No, it's a case of these are Sherman parts. Ship them forward.
Yeah.
Done.
And when people criticise the lack of development in the Sherman, although, as I've noted, the change to wet-stowed ammunition and 76 with HVAP ammunition was actually a huge step change in capability. People criticise saying, they didn't make the leap that the Germans did with the Panther and the Tiger. You've got your crew training pipeline. You've got your parts pipeline. You've got your manufacturing pipeline. You need a huge increase in capability to make it worth disrupting all those things versus saying, you know what, those guys have got one super tank, 5 very mediocre tanks, no crews that know how to actually use any of this. We've got 10 tanks that are in perfect running order and everyone knows how to use them. You are going to smash that other force. Smash it.
Not to mention, the American doctrine at the time was tanks don't fight tanks, tanks fight infantry.
The chieftain disagrees with that, but there was definitely some...
Yeah.
Because they had the whole tank destroyer corps in the US Army.
They did, but they left those behind because they thought we didn't need them.
They're never around when you want them, and anytime you had, suddenly you're fighting tanks, you use whatever's available. Similarly, the tank destroyers are all sitting around, and suddenly there's infantry to be fighting, and they're fighting as tanks just with no armour on their turrets, which is not ideal either.
No.
Which is where... On land, and it's an interesting difference because at sea, specialisation brings a lot of rewards, whereas on land, generalisation tends to still be rewarded. Which is why you now have just the concept of the main battle tank, which is supposed to fill most of the armour roles.
Yeah, and where they're trying to keep the reconnaissance roles, which is basically what's run into the idea of the light tanks. Suddenly you're upgunning those they can take on MBTs, but they don't have any armour, but they need speed, but they need to be reconnaissance. It all becomes to...
There's an interesting technology change in the reconnaissance role, which is that in 1940s you needed, I think, a 200 horsepower engine running full tilt to run a radio. So if your armoured vehicle is going forward to do reconnaissance, it needs to be a big armoured vehicle with a big engine, just to be able to run the radio to report back. Whereas in this day and age...
you're just getting drones to do it.
Well, yeah, but communications... I think there's still a role for an armoured scout vehicle, but it doesn't need to be huge just to run the radio.
No. Anyway, that's what we're talking... So... Lots of different variants. So, as we said, we got to the 76mm gun early on. So, again, it wasn't really big enough to be taking on the Tigers and Panthers directly, whereas the Russians and the T-34 are going from the 76mm gun up to an 88. 85, yep.
Mm-hmm. And the Tigers were firing 88s, of course.
So it could, whereas the Americans only went from the 75 to the 76. Again, a high-velocity gun, could penetrate, but still not as reliable a kill. You'd still need a number of tanks to be able to make sure you could take on the Tigers and the Panthers. But by that stage, they were getting overwhelming numbers, and they had the artillery and the close air support. And so suddenly the Germans, with no air left whatsoever, basically they did not want to get caught. So that's why they're going for the ambush kills and getting lots of ambush kills, but at the end of it, they'd still get blown up.
As we've discussed, ambushes are great if you can be doing them, but fundamentally, they reflect a situation where you are on the defensive and the enemy is attacking. And that indicates that on the bigger strategic picture, things aren't going great.
Interesting with the Shermans, the doctrine also was you advance with the infantry during the day. As soon as it gets dark, you pull back, rearm, refuel, repair, because you don't want to be anywhere near the front lines.
You don't want sneaky little buggers with panda shreks coming in up too.
So there was always a case of everybody wanted to have the armour around, but as soon as it got nighttime, they pulled back and pulled out of the line. So you got situations where the infantry felt a bit abandoned overnight as things happened, but that was for good reasons, because tanks are blind at night. They can't stop infantry coming in around them unless there is a company or battalion of infantry with them anyway, in which case, they might pull out and the tank will be left there by themselves, realising, where did everybody go? And suddenly there'll be grenades coming in inside.
Yeah, there is the famous story in the Battle of the Bulge when a retreating American tank came across a sergeant who was digging a foxhole. Apparently the sergeant said to the tank commander, "You just park your little tank behind me. We're the 82nd Airborne. We'll look after you."
And they did. So. But again, that's the point. If they don't have air support and if there's no infantry cover, then tanks are very vulnerable at night time because they can't see what's going on around them.
Yeah, although in modern warfare, there was certainly a period in the Cold War when tanks were the smallest vehicle that could have really good night vision, which changed that calculus for a while. Now everyone's got night vision, and that's certainly a different one. You still fundamentally have an issue that tanks don't have great visibility.
Now, one of the tank variants we want to go on to is the Firefly.
The Firefly.
So the British said, realising that their little 75mm guns that they were getting on the
starting to plink off
M4
the sides of the Tigers
were not working, and said, we've just got this wonderful 17-pounder
quick firing,
artillery piece. Why don't we whack that in the turret and see how it goes? And so there was a lot of opposition to it. So, no, you won't need anything bigger than a 75mm. No, it's too hard. No, it won't fit. Look, it's going to be overbalanced. No, the barrel's too long. But eventually...
all points that were actually true.
But it got to the end of the discussion and said, but we need something that'll work. And so they figured out a way of doing it. They turned the barrel on its side. They turned the 17-pounder on its side. They cut some more holes. They moved the gun loader. They did a bunch of things. They dropped the assistant driver, and
which is good. They were useless.
And eventually they got it in there. They put some counterweights on the back and made it a little bit longer, but they eventually got this 17-pounder artillery piece.
When we say 17-pounder, we should note that's referring to the weight of the cartridge that it fires.
Whereas the 75 was only a 6-pounder, so much smaller.
Yeah. Now, it's worth noting that the 17-pounder was in caliber terms a 76.2mm gun. So 0.2 of a millimeter,
but significantly wider bore, bigger and faster.
Yeah, the round was much bigger though, and the propellant gate made it faster. There are a lot of analyses done that it wasn't particularly accurate. It had a big problem with firing, discarding sabot rounds late in the war, I think.
Capped sabot rounds or something the British were using. But I don't think it had APDs.
So there were some accuracy issues with the 17-pounder, but what it did give, and where it was used well, was that you wouldn't put out a whole platoon of Sherman Fireflies with a 17-pounder gun.
No.
That was silly. But what you would do was have a four tank formation, and one of those would have the 17-pounder gun. So the others with their nice high explosive rounds on their 75mm could go out there and do general tank duties. And if they came up against something tough, the Firefly could twank it. So that's good. Twank. I think I've invented a new word.
Yep. Certainly have.
Yeah.
Shakespeare would be proud.
Shakespeare would be proud.
But
now, yes.
And the Germans, being the canny tank commanders are, soon learned that the one with the really long barrel was the one to kill first.
Which is also why with Fireflies that they would often have the barrel painted white from the last couple of meters of the barrel, so that at a distance it looked like it was a short little gun.
That's right. They tried to disguise it, and the British then figured out that the Germans knew that they knew that the tanks with the really long guns were the ones to kill first. So they said, right, we're going to camouflage the end 3 meters of our barrel, so it looks like we've only got the short 75mm barrel on it, and so they could hide amongst the other tanks.
Nothing to see here. Now, it should definitely be noted, the 17-pounder, the Sherman Firefly, the crew ergonomics were diabolical. It went from a tank with a really good crew ergonomics to really, really, really bad ones.
The loader's job was made easier because rather than having to lift the rounds, he just had to twist them sideways because the
breech was sideways.
Yeah, breech was sideways. He just had to take them from the rack of where they were stored and then turn sideways, and they'll be in the breech.
And even a 17-pound round in a 76.2mm bore is not an enormous tank round by modern standards. An American or British tanker of today, or a German one handling 120mm rounds, is dealing with a much bigger thing than
automations on those things.
Well, they don't. They still have the loader on those.
Yeah. The other thing is that by getting rid of the assistant driver, they also then were to get more ammunition in because of these much larger rounds. That's where they put the ammo. But of course, there was no
wet stowage.
Well, there was no way to get the ammo from where the assistant driver was to the loader inside the tank. So you had to basically wait till evening fell, drive back, and then move your ammo from the assistant driver into the turret on the outside of the tank, so you can then stow it again.
You'd almost think it's worth not carrying that ammunition with you, wouldn't you?
Well, you could do it as long as you weren't in active contact.
Yeah, but it's still something that can blow up and destroy your tank as well. I mean, it's a hazard inside your vehicle that you can't
win
access.
the first battle.
Yeah,
pull back 100 meters. Let the infantry, because they also
should
figured
always
out
be used to infantry. Yeah,
yeah. Well, the whole point was they knew they'd figured out the German tactics were let the Allies take the position, reform for a counterattack, and then while the Allies are running around, they're like having taken the objective and not knowing what to do next. That's when the Germans would counterattack and retake what they'd just lost, because they knew it was getting the enemy when it was disorganized after taking an objective was much easier than trying to defend something that they couldn't defend.
Now, I'm going to tell
That's like New Zealand rugby team, the counterattack.
Yeah, there's an very important moment, the Sherman Firefly, a seminal moment in tank development in history on multiple fronts.
John loves this one.
At some point, we are going to have to talk about the Tiger. That point is not today in a broader sense, but of course, the most celebrated commander of Tigers was Michael Wittmann, the great German tank ace. Almost certainly his numbers were bumped up for propaganda purposes. But he was still an amazing, possibly the greatest tank ace of all time, although the Israelis' Michael Schweker is probably on the podium with him as well. Anyway, Wittmann's really famous manoeuvre, he knocked out something like over 20 British Cromwells in one afternoon. Also, the British took all their objectives in that afternoon while Wittmann was racing around in his Tiger. So you could argue that, they lost their few Cromwells, but they took their objectives. That's not what we're going to debate today, but in the middle of this rampage with this Tiger tank racking up an astonishing kill count on the day, Wittmann did manage to get his T crossed by a Sherman Firefly, basically the only tank within many miles capable of penetrating the Tiger. And the Firefly tank commander ordered to fire, and at that point nothing happened. And they all looked around the tank and realised the loader wasn't in the tank. And then they looked backwards and saw that 100 or so metres behind, the loader was waving his tea kettle because he was out of the tank trying to make a cup of tea when they roared off to try and deal with Michael Wittmann.
As you do.
As you do. It was due to this and a number of other incidents that the British, in their post-war evaluations, although
didn't decide to regather the assistant driver who would have been out making the tea if it wasn't if they had a 5-person crew.
If only they'd had the assistant driver, he could have loaded the gun.
There you go, people. Or here's the other solution, John.
Yes, what they came up with, and is still a feature of every British armoured fighting vehicle, and a distinctive feature of British armoured fighting vehicles, is the boiling vessel, which is a small electric kettle that sits inside every tank and allows them to generate hot water.
So they can have a cup of tea inside the tank without climbing out
to light a fire. Which they had been doing. Something like, I believe it was in the order of 30% of British Armoured Corps casualties in World War II were discovered to have been crew members who had exited the vehicle to attempt to make tea.
Rather than standing on the back of your Sherman firing the 50 cal,
yes,
they were making
and
tea.
You could use the heat of the 50 cal to boil your tea if you really got thinking about this. Well, it's a tank. You've got a 400 horsepower engine churning away.
You need to dissipate the heat somehow. May as well use it to boil some water.
Yeah, the boiling vessel is electric, but it was also very good for making soup and for bathing. So there are significant reasons to have a boiling vessel in one's tank. But the Sherman Firefly, in a case of a miserable failure to deal with the threat of Michael Wittmann and the Tiger, demonstrated in a striking light the need to have a kettle in your tank.
All right. What else do we want to discuss about? Now, there will be a lot of passion about the M4 because a lot of people say, well, it won the Second World War for the Allies, and other people say, well, no, the T-34 won it because it was the Eastern Front and there was more tank-on-tank activity there. And other people say, well, the Panther was
many M4s fought on the Eastern Front.
Yes,
huge numbers.
Almost 4,000, mostly on both the northern and southern flanks, crewed by the Russians, provided by the Lend-Lease activities. I wonder if the Americans ever got the money for that.
Yeah. It should be noted that I believe the Lee tanks that were provided before the Shermans, the Russians referred to as the coffin for seven brothers. They did not have a high opinion of that, possibly because of the main gun was not in a turret.
When driving the Lee tank in World of Tanks, it is one of the particular grinds of the game, saying because you cannot do shit with it. It's a very bad medium tank, but it progresses onto the M4 and other good tanks.
Now, Rob, you just said a bad word in our podcast. And I'd like to cast your mind back about a decade ago when we were doing a rugby podcast, and I got in trouble for my bad language because your mother didn't like it.
I'm sure I didn't say anything bad like that.
All right. Okay, moving on. Sorry. So, yes, the M4 was actually incredibly important and influential on the Eastern Front as well. And a point that we've sort of touched on, but I want to really hammer home, is it's all very well and good to say, this German tank was super, and it particularly had really good top trumps numbers because it was made in a factory and it was never used more than 500 miles further away from the factory that it was made in. The M4 had to be made in a factory in the US and be shipped, unknown to its builder, anywhere from the Arctic Circle to the jungles of the South Pacific. And it had to function and operate at the differences between, minus 30 degrees and 40 degrees and, freezing and boiling and hot and humid and sandy. The variance of places where the M4 had to function was something that Russian and German tanks never entered their builders' minds.
No. And the compatibility within the environments they're working with. So being able to standardization between tanks to be able to swap parts between all of them. So, it was it really was quantity being its own quality, and that you've got so many of them, and they will all work. They're reliable, they're maintainable, easily to train on, and they just keep on going.
Yeah, and there's an adequacy point of view. It needs to meet a minimum standard.
80% good enough for government work.
Yeah.
Sticking with that and saying that's where they're at, and it did. Yes, they probably could have done some more innovation to get the bigger guns in when they started seeing the failures of the tank against the Panthers and the Tigers. But by that stage, they're saying, well, as you said, there's a lot of changes that would have to be made to implement that. And look, in the South Pacific, when they were, in the Pacific when they were fighting against the Japanese, there was no tank-on-tank battles. So it was just taking out pillboxes and avoiding the infantry.
I'm not sure you'd have noticed a Japanese tank anyway. There was a point with the M4 that, again, with its design constraints for weight, that it fitted just fine into not a standard Mills boat, but some reasonably common amphibious things that could, just wash up on the beach, drop the ramp down, and the M4 could trundle off, and a bigger, heavier, sexier tank would have never got onto that beach at all. No. So, it's easy to understate how important these standardizations are, and the Sherman's critics generally don't get the importance of that, and that it was part of a war-winning system of weapons rather than being a tank with tons of armour and a sexy gun.
And realistically, the number of different tanks that the British were trying earlier on in the World War, so they were coming up with so many different designs, and they were all separately made. Some were welded, some were riveted, some were moulded armour, some had 2-pound guns, some had 5-pound guns, they had so many different variants. They had fast tanks, they had cruiser tanks, you had your infantry tanks. The Americans said, right, we're going to do one.
Oh, hang on. Well, let's not give them too much credit. American tank doctrine was just as much of a hot mess.
Yeah. Well, the point being is that they said, right, this one's good enough for anything, we'll just make that.
Yeah.
And whereas a lot of other people were saying, no, we need a tank for this or tank that, or no, this railroad company over here can build us this sort of tank, so we're going to let them build 50 of those. This tractor company over here is going to can build this sort of tank, so we'll let them build 100 of those. There was no, they really needed some, and became a hot mess.
Yeah, there is also an issue that we've touched on before, that aircraft engines are a surprisingly important part of the tank story.
Cromwell's.
Well, yeah, Cromwell's Comets and then Centurion were all depended on the evolution of the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, which is basically Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that weren't good enough to put in planes.
It's probably because they only had one factory building them, whereas the Americans were building factories to build tanks.
There is that, but you basically, if you see a picture of the M4's engine, it's a radial aircraft engine. And it wasn't actually a great fit for it, which is why you end up with this huge boxy hull. But it fitted in the ship and it worked. And there's an interesting argument I've heard as well with people claiming that the M4 wasn't actually any more reliable than comparable tanks, but what it was really serviceable and it had lots of spare parts. So even if it broke down at the same rate of all the others, it was repaired much quicker.
Yeah, and the logistics chain was probably better service.
And that, in some sense, just becomes a distinction with our difference. It's like, okay, great, I'm glad that your Panther has exactly the same number of miles per breakdown. But if it doesn't have... If literally the Germans had tank crews fighting each other at railheads for parts, you know... I know which system I'd rather be in. And like I said before, if you put me back into late 1944 and said you have to fight on a hot part of the front, but you can choose which tank, I would probably go with an M4 Sherman with wet stowage and a 76 with HVAC. I think you are safer in that tank than you are in any other tank in the war.
Right, there you go. All right.
And I'd have war stories about how my tank got hit and it was terrifying, but that'd be because I survived to tell the tale. Also, the Ronson thing. Shall we talk about that?
Oh, yes. There's one of the stories is that they were called Ronsons because they lit up the first time every time, which was the cigarette lighter company Ronson came out with this ad saying that. But supposedly they're saying that they didn't come out with the ad until 1951, so it was after the war. Whereas the other one, the Germans are saying, we call them Tommy Cookers because they call the British crews Tommies, and they were fighting a lot of those before the Americans rocked up. So in North Africa, that was mainly what they were facing. The British M4s over there. So, and they'd say, "Yep, cook them up," and away they went. But look, before they had the wet storage, it was any tank would be a dangerous proposition if where the position of the rounds were. But the Ronson thing was. I don't know.
I'm convinced it's survivor bias.
All right, there you go.
But that's it. Anyway, this has been a long podcast. We knew it would be because the M4...
I'm sure there'll be plenty of people with passions about why the Panther 5 and the Tiger 6 and the T-34 was better and how the T-34 was built for the flat plains of Russia, which is why it was built, and how the high cupola and turret was better built for the hills and byways of Europe.
Which is Rob's way of saying, we await your comments, dear listener. Do please leave a comment on any of the many and varied social media on which this podcast will appear. We look forward to it. We're happy to... We look forward to reading out what you've got to tell us, assuming it's nice. Otherwise, we'll just ignore you. Okay, I think we've spoken long enough. Thank you very much for everyone who's listened this far. We will be back next month with another tank.
Yay!
Woo!
Totally tanked.
Tanked.